Our world is indeed a grim place. It seems that the fabric of civility, the fabric of civilization is unraveling, coming apart at the seams. Even in this country, as we look around, we wonder, where has civility gone? And as we gaze across the wider expanse of the planet, we ask, where is civilization going? In our own country, we wonder about the increasingly effective attempts to erase God from any sphere in the public square. And we recognize we head into a darker tomorrow that is characterized by the absence of God. Now, good-hearted people, Christ followers, tend to wring their hands about such a reality. What are we to do? There is cause, make no mistake about it, for the hand-wringing at times. But may I point out to you that as society becomes darker, we move closer and closer to the reality that would have been the society in which the first church, the early church, lived and moved and worked. In a culture called the Roman Empire, those Christ followers were a small minority. The ethic of Jesus was far from dominating the day. Darkness surrounded them. The church had to make a choice about how it would encounter the darkness, how it would live effectively in such a society. And we are headed there again, it seems. In fact, according to the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, here in this country, the United States of America, 1 in 5 people who are non-churched, those who do not have a knowledge of Jesus Christ, say, I do not even have a Christian acquaintance or friend. Period. I know no one of Christian faith. 1 in 5. That's about 13, 14 million people. If you increase the range of that to the global reality, 8 in 10 say, I know no one who is a Christ follower. In other words, when you move into the public square, there is a dearth of understanding about the gospel. Philip Yancey, the writer, tells about having had a conversation with a Muslim gentleman who said to Yancey, I have read the Quran, and in the Quran I can find no instruction for how Muslims are to live as a minority. None. But, he said, I have also read the New Testament various times. And in the New Testament, I can find no instruction regarding how Christians are to live in the majority. Yancey, reflecting on those words, wrote this: Christians best thrive as a minority, a counterculture. Historically, when Christians reach a majority, they have yielded to the temptations of power in ways that are clearly anti-gospel. What does that mean? It means that as we move into a culture that is increasingly dark, the Christian church, Christ followers, people like us, have a choice to make. How will we respond to that when we are once again where the early church was, in the minority? How do we respond? Some answer that question by saying we stand aside from culture, we point our finger at it, and we preach prophetically and curse the darkness. Others say, no, a more effective way to deal with the dark night is to light a candle. Because even the darkest night can be pierced, can be penetrated by the light that shines from a single candle. If you ask me, that was the choice the Apostle Paul made. Paul, in writing to the church in ancient Colossae, was writing to a group of people gathered probably in a house church, a group of people he neither founded nor had ever met. A group of people who were at a distance from him, and yet about whom he had heard some things that deeply concerned him, enough so that he put quill pen to parchment and wrote them a missive. He's writing to a group of people who are distinctly in the minority, surrounded by a dark society and culture. It is what he says to them in today's passage that gives me the distinct impression that if Paul faces the darkness, he says, don't stand apart from it and point your finger at it and curse it, but recognize that you live within it and allow your life to be a candle that pierces the night. Go with me to Colossians chapter 4, page 1757, 1757 if you're reaching for a pew Bible. Colossians chapter 4. And as we turn there, I want to set the context for where we are. We're in the next to last passage of Colossians, almost at the end of the letter. What has Paul been doing in this letter? In the early half of the letter, he has been exalting Jesus Christ. I have chosen to term it the cosmic Christ, because there may be no Christology higher than what you find in the letter to the Colossians. Here Paul writes about Jesus by saying he is the image of the invisible of God, the firstborn over all creation. He is the creator of all things. In him everything holds together. He is seated at the right hand of the Father on high. But in Colossians, Paul will not remain in the heady heights where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. He will also descend down to the earth, down to the common pathways of the common disciple, and will talk with us about what it means to live as a follower of Christ. He has done it already in this half of Colossians by speaking of the kinds of virtues that we are to develop as Christ followers, things like patience and kindness and compassion and love. He has spoken about our family realities and said, in your families, nobody has a hold on power. Even the vulnerable are protected. He's talked about the realities of the common disciple's life. But today he comes to a passage, a short one, in which he has something to say about how we are to respond to the darkness around us. He tells us to light a candle. The act of lighting that candle consists of two things, two simple things: pray and speak. So we begin with pray. Colossians chapter 4, verse 2 says this: devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. And pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly, as I should. Pray, pray, pray. 3 times in that passage, Paul speaks of prayer, even using the word devote yourselves to prayer. You can picture him in your mind's eye, can't you? Manacled and bound in a prison, staring at the backside of a prison door that bars his way to freedom. You can almost imagine him staring at that door, wondering if that door would but open as it did for Peter. It would give me a passageway into the freedom beyond. So it doesn't surprise us when Paul prays here that he prays that a door may be opened. But don't misunderstand. Paul does not pray that a door may be opened for me, that I might find freedom again. He doesn't even say, pray for me that I might be able to deal with the trials and the difficulties of being a prisoner. He doesn't say that. Instead, he speaks to those Colossian followers of Christ and says to them, pray that a door may be opened, that I might proclaim the mystery of Christ. And pray that I might proclaim it clearly, as I should. You remember the mystery of Christ. He's spoken of it already in this letter. The mystery of Christ is that from the deep and dark, distant past, God has had in mind to save everyone on the planet, to bring all together in one, in Christ, both Jew and Gentile. It is for preaching that mystery that Paul has landed in prison. And yet, even as a prisoner, he says, pray that a door might open, that I might somehow, in the midst of a dark culture called the Roman Empire, that I might be able to proclaim clearly and with courage the truth about Jesus. I find it surprising. Maybe you don't, maybe you do. I find it surprising that the Apostle Paul, the eminent firebrand for God, in writing to a small cadre of Christ's followers whom he does not even know, would say to them, would you pray for me? Pray that I might have courage. Pray that I might have clarity. Would you pray for me? I find that surprising. The great apostle asking the common disciples for prayer. Mr. Rogers of TV fame, the sweatered one, Mr. Rogers, the one who was a child at heart, a Christ follower at heart, years ago was visiting our state, California. While here in California, he had the opportunity to visit a teenager with cerebral palsy. The teenager had apparently seen Mr. Rogers many times on the screen in his home and was told that he would have the opportunity to visit with him. He was excited beyond what he was able to express or contain when Mr. Rogers came in. The spasticity of his movements, his excitement, became rather extreme to the point where he even began to strike himself. His mother, concerned and maybe a bit embarrassed, immediately removed him from the room, took him to another room where he could calm down. When she brought him back out to see Mr. Rogers immediately said to him, Would you do me a favor? On his computer, the team responded, yes. Mr. Rogers said, would you pray for me? Would you pray for me? The mother would later say that was a most significant moment for him. In fact, after he had already left and some time had passed, he said it was a significant moment because he continued to bask in the glow of his thought process, which said, Mr. Rogers likes God and God likes Mr. Rogers, and Mr. Rogers likes me. If Mr. Rogers likes me, that must mean that God likes me. But what struck one of the journalists who saw that moment, who later questioned Mr. Rogers about it, was this. He said to him, I thought that was very special what you did for that young man. Very special that you treated him in that fashion, that you asked him to pray for you. And Mr. Rogers said, maybe you misunderstood. I didn't ask him to pray for me for him to feel better about it, for me to minister to him. I asked him to pray for me because I wanted his intercession. Because I believe that somebody in that condition for this long who believes in God has wrestled deeply with God. And I wanted his prayer. Makes me think of Paul writing to Colossian believers. Would you pray for me? Pray that a door would be opened, that I might speak the mystery of Christ and do it with clarity, do it with courage. When it comes to the act of Paul lighting a candle in the darkness of his society, he begins in the prayer closet. It's as though he recognizes that any great and powerful movement for God will begin in the prayers of God's people. Kind of a reflection of the 6th century BC Chinese general and strategist Sun Tzu, who wrote in his volume, The Art of War, every battle is won or lost long before the battle begins. Maybe Paul understood that. And understood if we are going to have an influence, an impact on the culture around us, it will begin with the people of God in their closets, in their hearts, in their homes, in their prayers. So when Paul writes to his Colossian friends, people who are surrounded by a dark culture, and tells them what they ought to do, first thing he says is pray. Begin with prayer. So let me ask you, how is it with you? How often do you frequent your prayer closet? Does each day find you in solitude and silence before God? When life gets tough, does your heart turn to God as naturally as the flower turns to the sun, as one author puts it? When decimating tragedies erupt, when Paris, the city of lights, becomes Paris, the city of tears, what is your first inclination? Paul says, if you are to live a life that will lighten the darkness around you, begin with prayer. Pray. But Paul says a second thing here. He not only says, pray, he also says, speak. It must begin in prayer, but it cannot end in prayer. Speak. Back to Colossians chapter 4, this time we begin in verse 5. He says, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Let your conversation be always full of grace. Be wise. Make the most of every opportunity. Paul clearly does not want a religion that doesn't act. He says you must begin with prayer, but then there is time for action, time to do something, time to speak up. But he says, make certain that your speech is characterized by grace. The year that Jimmy Carter became president of this country, he was invited to address the delegation of the Southern Baptist Convention. 17,000 delegates were there. 3 were invited to address the delegates at this point in the event. President Carter was one of those. Each of the speakers was given 5 minutes. Can you imagine? Mr. President, you've got 5 minutes, sir. That's it. 5 minutes. The first speaker was to be the Reverend Billy Graham. The third speaker was to be President Jimmy Carter. It was that speaker that was sandwiched between them who was shaking in his boots. He was a truck driver, asked to share his testimony. He was seated on the platform between these two, and he was literally shaking. I can't do this. I don't think I can do it. What am I going to say? I don't know what to do. I don't know how to speak. This is not what I do. The moment came, and the Reverend Billy Graham stepped to the podium and in polished, experienced words spoke of Jesus Christ. And then it was time. And this gentleman, this truck driver, stood and quaked over to the rostrum, gripped it with both hands. And as his voice quavered, his head bowed, trying to speak into the mic, he said, most of my life, I was drunk. When I wasn't driving, I was at the bar. He picked up just a little bit of steam. He said, somehow Jesus Christ reached into my heart and my life and turned it around. Voice still quavering. He then told how, out of that experience of having been touched by the grace of God, by the mercy of Jesus, his life was changed. But then he said, then I had to speak. I had to say something. I couldn't keep all of this inside. But the problem was, he says, I didn't know anybody. Only people I knew were in that bar. So he said, I took a breath and I went back to the bar. Only this time to tell them about Jesus. Well, the barkeep didn't appreciate that all that much and immediately disinvited him. But he'd invested a lot in that bar, and he became a bit pushy and just kept coming back. He said, before I was done with that bar, I had led 14 of my friends to Jesus. 14. Because he wouldn't be quiet. Because he had to speak with and about grace. President Carter would later say this about that event. The truck driver's speech was the highlight of the convention. I don't believe anyone who was there will ever forget that 5-minute fumbling statement or remember what I or even Billy Graham had to say. Because someone spoke. Out of the authenticity of that deep, that abiding, that meaningful experience with Jesus. If you want to light a candle in the darkness, it begins in the quiet of your own soul with God. But it cannot stay there. At some point, we have to stand and speak. Speak with grace about grace. But maybe you notice something that Paul here says. It's a curious thing, he says, when we read it. He says, let your conversation always be filled with grace and, you remember that line? Seasoned with salt. What in the world does that mean? I mean, when we think about salty language, it's not usually combined with grace. We think of salty language, we usually say, she can swear like a sailor. That's salty language for you. And yet here comes Paul and he says, let your conversation be seasoned with salt. In the ancient world, it was a term, a metaphor that was used to depict speech that was witty, that was humorous, that was engaging, that was compelling. You know what Paul is saying? He is saying, I want your conversation to be seasoned with salt. I don't want it to be some insipid, dull, and boring speech that you give. It has to be filled with all the wit and the charm of Jesus. And for heaven's sakes, throw in some humor. I think sometimes the church bores people out the door. Bores them out. Often people aren't bad, they're bored. What is there for me? How does that connect with my life in any meaningful way? Makes me think of the preacher who on the way to church one morning was driving and was praying, oh God, please let something happen in church today that's not in the bulletin. Anything. Something. Let it be seasoned with salt. Yes, it does need to be filled with grace. I remember being told by our Christian ministry teacher, senior year of college, Christian ministry class. I don't know where this happened or to whom. All I remember is our teacher told us the story. A woman coming to visit an Adventist church, apparently for the first time. Walking in the lobby. She was decked out, dressed to the nines, fancy hat, large feather, and all. Came walking into church, caught by a woman there greeting, who greeted her warily and then said, ma'am, In this church, we don't believe in feathers. And the lady looked at her and said, "Oh, good. I don't either. I believe in Jesus." It's that kind of conversation that riles a preacher, angers a preacher. Thank God for her response. Let it have some joy, some juice, some energy. Season it with salt, says Paul. When you engage in the world around you, why would they ever want to come to listen if there isn't something that stirs your own soul, your own heart, with a sense of reality and with a sense of charm? Speak, he says, with grace, seasoned with salt. It's a dark culture, a dark world. What are we to do? Paul says, I want you to do two things. I want you to pray, and I want you to speak. I want you to do that, I think he's saying, because if you're praying and you're speaking, that will be your life. Then you will live in a way that lights a candle in your world. You know what concerns me? Those statistics referenced earlier from the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, those statistics that say there are so many around us who don't even know a single Christian. It's the other direction that concerns me. It's looking in the mirror and asking myself, having you look in the mirror and ask yourself, is there anyone I know out there that isn't part of this circle where I can pray and speak and shine a light in a dark world? If we will do that, if we will pray, if we will speak, then we will live in a way that one flickering candle at a time will illumine the darkness. God of grace, please light the candle in our hearts and in our souls. Lead us to the place of prayer. But then expel us from that place into a world that is hurting and dark, that we might shine for Jesus. In His name, amen.